Moving on to Assemblymember Ting's items, beginning with AB 681. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill because the earlier issuance of audit reports would make audits more relevant and allow counties to incorporate audit recommendations into their existing practices much sooner. We note, however, that this bill could result in additional workload and responsibilities for which the Board of Equalization is not currently funded and could require them to schedule meetings during an assessor's busy time due to tighter deadlines because of the way the bill is constructed.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Moving on to AB 1321. Witnesses in support, please come forward.
Hi, I'm Justin Rauza with Roots of Change. We're one of the co-sponsors for 1321. We appreciate the staff's analysis. We thought Robert did a great job. One of the things that we wanted to add to it is that we're working with the author and Robert to provide more clarifying amendments to address some of the concerns he had around when the program would be operative. One of the new points of data that we received is that the federal funds right now is structured to where it would require a match. But in the 3 remaining RFAs, so about $65 million in funds, that they might strike the matching requirement from the federal funds that would fund 1321. And so with that, then the fiscal impacts on the state would be considerably lower than what's proposed in the analysis. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Complimenting staff on,
Hi, good afternoon.
During the suspense file. Go ahead.
Rebecca De La Rosa with Latino Coalition for a Healthy California, also co-sponsor of the bill, and we're in strong support of the program, Nutrition Incentives Program, that would be created under the bill. We're modeling the program after Washington State Department of Public Health. They were the largest recipient of the federal grants that were available, and so we believe that that estimate of $150,000 to staff an additional evaluator by the department can go a long way in our community. Thanks.
Jessica Bartholow with the Western Center on Law and Poverty and Support.
Excuse me. Mr. Chair and members, Monica Miller on behalf of the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California in support. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this. Oh, sorry, Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill, but we would note that the California Department of Food and Agriculture indicates the bill would result in needing multiple positions and potentially several $1 million in ongoing general fund costs, a portion of which would be for administrative costs that could be offset by federal funds if awarded by the federal government.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Members, we're going to quickly return back to those items that are open to allow our members that haven't added on to add on. We're going to begin with AB 85, Assemblymember Wilk, that has a due pass recommendation. That is Assemblymember Wilk. Secretary, please call the roll.
The motion is due pass to the Senate floor. Mendoza? Aye. Mendoza, aye.
7-0. This item is out. Next, we have AB 1358 by Senator DeBobne. It's a due pass recommendation. Secretary, please call the roll.
Bell? Bell, aye. Leyva? Aye. Leyva, aye. Mendoza? Aye. Mendoza, aye.
5-2. This item is out. Next, we have AB 281 by Assemblymember Gallagher. That's a due pass recommendation. Secretary, please call the roll.
Bell? Bell, aye. Hill? Aye. Hill, aye. Leyva? Aye. Leyva, aye.
7-0. That item is out. Next, we have AB 442 by Assemblywoman Irwin. Secretary, please call the roll.
The motion is due pass to the Senate floor. Lara?
Aye.
Lara, aye. Mendoza? Aye. Mendoza, aye.
7-0. This item is out. Next, we have Assemblymember Patterson, AB 483. That's due pass as amended. Secretary, please call the roll.
Bell? Bell, aye. Leyva? Aye. Leyva, aye. Mendoza? Aye. Mendoza, aye.
7-0. That item is out. Next, we have AB 606 by Assemblymember Levine. That's a due pass recommendation. Secretary, please call the roll.
Hill. Hill, aye. Leyva. Leyva, aye.
7-0, that item is out. Moving on to AB 1295, Levine. That's a due pass recommendation. Secretary, please call the roll.
Hill. Hill, aye. Leyva. Leyva, aye.
7-0, that item is out. Moving on to Assemblymember Bloom, AB 1250. That's a due pass recommendation. Secretary, please call the roll.
Mendoza. Mendoza, aye.
7-0, that item is out. The next item is AB 999 by Assemblymember Daly. It's a due pass recommendation. Secretary, please call the roll.
Bates. Bates, aye. Bell. Bell, aye. Mendoza. Mendoza, aye. Nielsen. Nielsen, aye.
7-0, that item is out. Next and last due pass item for this agenda is AB 1516 by the Housing and Community Housing Development Committee. Secretary, please call the roll.
Bates. Bates, aye. Mendoza. Mendoza, aye. Nielsen. Nielsen, aye.
7-0, that item is out. Thank you, members. Those are all the due pass recommendations. We're going to continue with our items that are suspense items where we've waived presentation. We are going to go back to AB 174 by Assemblymember Gray. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill because it creates new annual general fund obligations above the augmentations for higher ed that were included in the Budget Act. These new costs would be unsustainable within the administration's long-term budget framework. Additionally, the bill sets aside funds for a specific UC program, which is inconsistent with the administration's broader approach to providing general fund resources to the university.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 192 by Assemblymember Allen. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill because it would result in unplanned costs for the general fund. While the bill allows for at least some portion of these costs for outreach by the Coastal Commission to be recovered, most specialized license plate programs do not begin to generate revenue until at least the second year, and the level of revenue generated varies greatly and may be insufficient to support the costs.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Manshine's items. That's AB 193. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill as it results in increased costs for counties to conduct additional investigations and to file court reports regarding LPS conservatorships for individuals not currently eligible for such conservatorships. In the long term, there could be pressure on the Department of State hospitals as well to admit additional commitments. These commitments are supported by county reimbursements, resulting in no net general fund costs. They would all be local costs.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 316, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill, and we note that the availability of out-of-state veterinarians to attend to cases of animal cruelty and fighting in California would provide relief to veterinary industries in small communities that might otherwise be strained by large animal cruelty and animal fighting cases. We estimate that any additional costs would be minor and absorbable.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move that item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1051, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance opposes this bill because it could increase the state prison population, which impacts the state's ability to comply with the federal court order to keep the population below 137.5% of design capacity. Additionally, it could result in general fund costs not included in the administration's current fiscal plan.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Senator Frazier's item, AB 194, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill because it does not require approved toll facility projects to generate sufficient revenues to cover the maintenance and operations of the toll facility.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assembly DeBobne's items, beginning with AB 221. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because DMV estimates one-time costs of approximately $300,000 from the motor vehicle account to perform this study. We also note that while there are no direct ongoing costs associated with this bill, to the extent that the study drives future legislation, there could be significant costs associated with the implementation of a digital driver's license and identification card program. We've noted before, and we will continue to note, that the motor vehicle account has a structural deficit, and we predict that it will be insolvent by 2017-18.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 259, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it may result in additional significant costs to the state.
Thank you. Comments or questions? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1269, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill. While the advanced manufacturing, sales, and use tax exemption is intended to stimulate economic growth in areas that promote innovation and conservation, this exemption is underutilized and duplicative of an existing sales tax exclusion. The bill extends a program that essentially picks winners and losers in relation to projects that are eligible for a sales tax exclusion when a broader and more equitable program exists. Additionally, extending the program may be premature given that there are 2 outstanding reports on the efficacy of the program that will not be available until January 2017. The bill is expected to reduce state and local tax revenue by $11 million per year.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move that item to a suspense file. Moving on to AB 1292. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. AB 1319. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because resources would be required to implement the bill, and it constitutes an expansion of eligibility that's not included in the governor's spending plan. Department of Healthcare Services anticipates increased costs in the range of $100,000, $50,000 of which would be general fund, to allow certain share of cost Medi-Cal beneficiaries to retain the additional monthly amount. This bill may also result in potential significant costs related to information technology changes. DHCS indicates that by increasing the income deduction for individuals with share of cost Medi-Cal, those with income slightly above the income threshold for the aged, blind, and disabled federal poverty level category, a full scope category within Medi-Cal that has no share of cost, will be eligible to transition to that category. DHCS has also stated that an increased enrollment in the federal poverty level category would cost approximately $1 million annually, $500,000 of which is general fund for 200 additional beneficiaries.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move that item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Wood's item, starting with AB 320. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it results in costs not included in the administration's current fiscal plan. We are concerned that by not establishing a new license type, it's questionable as to how this bill ensures consumer protection.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to a suspense file. Moving on to AB 1231. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill as it expands benefits in the Medi-Cal program and adds significant additional general fund costs that were also not part of the budget. The bill results in local assistance costs ranging from $3 to $6 million, $1 to $2.5 million of which would be general fund, for increased capitation payments to Medi-Cal managed care plans that do not currently offer non-medical transportation as a benefit, for offering the benefit directly to fee-for-service beneficiaries. The department would also require an additional position at a cost of approximately $100,000 to develop and implement utilization control guidelines for the new benefit.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblywoman Lopez's items, AB 260. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill. We don't see it as increasing costs to the counties. To the extent that the bill results in fewer children being removed from their dependent parents, counties could experience child welfare costs decreasing.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assembly Dali's remaining items, beginning with AB 429. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill, but we note that DGS may incur some level of administrative costs, as a result of this measure. However, it's unclear if the costs would have a material impact on the DGS budget. To the extent that businesses qualifying for the preference are bidding on large contracts, the cost to provide the preference could be significant, which means that the measure could increase the state's contracting costs by an unknown but potentially significant amount annually, which would be paid by various funding sources, including the general fund.
Thank you. Comments or concerns from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to a suspense file. Moving on to AB 590. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill. The California Energy Commission estimates that it would need $580,000 GGRF and 5 positions based on an annual amount appropriated by the legislature of $10 million GGRF for the program that the bill authorizes. These positions would develop regulations, engage in public outreach, and process subsidy payments to between 30 and 75 eligible facilities. The Air Resources Board estimates a fiscal impact of $316,000 each year for 2 years and $175,000 ongoing thereafter, which includes 1 permanent air resources engineer and 1 air pollution specialist for 2 years. We would note that both of these estimates are subject to change and dependent on the amount of GGRF that's actually appropriated by the legislature to support the program that the bill creates. And of course, any request for additional resources related to this bill's implementation would be subject to review for workload adjustment during the budget process.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense. Moving on to Assembly Nazarian's items, beginning with AB 270. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 374. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it can significantly limit one of the tools that health plan and insurance providers use to control drug utilization costs. Step therapy requires an enrollee to try a less costly medication, often a generic alternative, before the prescribed medication. Often a more expensive brand name medication is approved. Health plans and insurers use step therapy to manage utilization of medications. We believe this bill will result in one-time costs to the Department of Managed Healthcare and to the Department of Insurance of $262,000 to develop and promulgate regulations related to the development of a standardized step therapy override determination form. According to a CHBRP analysis on an earlier version of this bill, if all override determinations are approved, this bill may also drive a total cost increase of $1.3 million, half of which would be general fund, in the Medi-Cal and CalPERS programs.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 521, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Finance is opposed to this bill because it's duplicative of other state efforts to identify and link HIV-positive people into healthcare, and it results in unknown additional state healthcare costs.
Well, that never stopped us before. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. AB 1157, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill. We estimate that the bill has no fiscal impact since it maintains the current procedure for determining the value of commercial aircrafts for property tax purposes.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Obernolte item, AB 271. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill because it provides state-subsidized child care providers and alternative payment agencies cost-effective options to maintain records within existing state and federal law. To the extent that a provider or alternative payment agency realizes local cost savings from employing technology to maintain records, this bill may result in these entities using current funding more efficiently.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we will move this item to suspense file. Moving on to Assemblywoman Melendez items, beginning with AB 289. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill because it extends whistleblower protections and that other state workers already have to legislative employees.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Moving on to AB 545. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it appears unnecessary. We note that courts already have the discretion to impose a county jail sentence of up to 1 year as appropriate for domestic battery. If a court decides to grant probation, it's unclear that the mandatory 2 days in jail would achieve an additional deterrent.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move that item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Santiago's items, beginning with AB 292. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because it could create potentially significant Prop 98 general fund reimbursable state mandate for local educational agencies to adjust their calendars and operations to accommodate the time changes envisioned for breakfast and lunch periods. The bill also imposes unnecessary basic operational requirements on school districts that we believe are best addressed at the local level.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we will move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1102. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill. We think that it's unnecessary and that it creates significant cost pressures in Mr. MIP.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Rolling right along the agenda here, we have now Assemblymember Gordon's items, beginning with AB 339. Witnesses in support.
Seth Bramble here on behalf of the California Teachers Association in support.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it creates a regulatory framework that limits a health plan or insurer's ability to effectively control and manage healthcare costs related to drug formularies.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 901. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill. We think it strengthens the requirement of solid waste operators to provide data to CalRecycle.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1200. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it results in additional general fund costs that are not envisioned in the budget. The Secretary of State estimates costs of $245,000 general fund in the first year and ongoing costs of $230,000 general fund annually, and 3 positions to manage the increased workload associated with lobbyist and lobbying firm registrations and report filings as a result of this measure. The FPPC estimates costs of $1.3 million general fund in the first year and ongoing costs of $1.1 million annually in 11 positions. The one-time costs are to promulgate new major regulations, prepare compliance materials, and modify lobbying manuals and forms. And the ongoing costs are attributed to the significant increase in requests for advice and to conduct additional investigations. We would note that any request for additional expenditure authority is subject to review and approval through the annual budget process.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1482. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblywoman Weber's items, beginning with AB 340. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill. We think that any cost to implement it should be minor and absorbable within existing resources available to the segments. However, to the extent that the Commission on State Mandates determines that the bill creates a state mandate on community college districts, specifically to adopt and publish policies, those districts would be entitled to reimbursement of those costs. The Chancellor's Office has estimated $2,000 per community college district, which statewide would mean $144,000 if that were correct.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 713, witnesses in support. Come on down. Don't hurt yourself.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Tony Triguero on behalf of the California Teachers Association. We're a co-sponsor of AB 713. We will appreciate working with the committee while it's on suspense to reconcile the cost estimates. We believe AB 713 will generate modest ADA increases, and we don't believe that there will be the enrollment increases that are referenced in the analysis. We also think that we have a way of guaranteeing that only per pupil funding costs would be reimbursed in the bill and not other costs that districts may associate with mandatory kindergarten. And we want to remind the committee it passed this similar bill last year, and we're looking forward to continued negotiations with the governor's office if this bill's passed off suspense. Thank you.
Thank you. Although today is another year, different year. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill, which has significant additional costs. The bill increases the Proposition 98 guarantee by $334 million to $754 million in fiscal year 2017-18 and $427 million to $713 million in 18-19 by increasing the number of students in public school. Within the increased guarantee amount, the bill creates ongoing costs of $276 million to $620 million, Prop 98 General Fund, associated with serving additional kindergarten students at the applicable local control funding formula and special education rates. This estimate assumes that kindergarten average daily attendance increases by 28,000 to 63,000 students. To the extent that these students are otherwise in child care and development programs funded by the state and will instead enroll in kindergarten, we may see some offsetting savings.
Thank you. With that, comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 953. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Please come forward.
John Lovell with the California Police Chiefs Association, the Association for LA Deputy Sheriffs, Los Angeles Police Protective League, California College and University Police Chiefs. We are concerned about the cost elements involved in the creation of multiple reports. One of the challenges we have right now is that there isn't any kind of universal reporting infrastructure. They're all different in different agencies. We have provided to the committee the cost estimates for police chiefs around the state. And as you'll see two things. First of all, in the aggregate, those costs are substantial. And secondly, the methodologies differ wildly around the state. We believe that a better approach would be to start with the creation of a universal reporting infrastructure. Nobody has any room for racial profiling. Police chiefs discipline quickly up to and including termination for this kind of activity. But the cost estimates here are substantial. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it likely results in a reimbursable state mandate due to the increased documentation and reporting requirements on local entities. Additionally, the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training has estimated it will need $120,000 to $350,000 to modify current course material or develop new course material to meet the requirements of this bill, and Post is facing a structural shortfall in the Peace Officers Training Fund and therefore cannot support any additional expenditures. Also, according to the Department of Justice, they'll need $10.5 million in fiscal year 2016-17 and $9.6 million ongoing for staff costs associated with the additional workload required by this bill. CHP has also indicated that it will need funding and positions to design and produce new forms to collect, process, and analyze the new information to be collected pursuant to this bill.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file.